I am joined here on the set by Senior Director of Tech Policy at Microsoft, Paul Mitchell, Director at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, Mary Saunders, and Policy Specialist at the Internet Society, Sally Wentworth. Welcome all, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. Now, I understand you're going to fill us in on some potentially disturbing changes that might be coming on Internet governance, right?
That's right.
That's foreshadowing. That's to get them all. Wait, what? Do tell.
Well, where to start?
Yeah.
So, 1988, there was a treaty signed by about 170 some odd countries that governed how our international telecommunications system operates. And it covers things like how money is transferred from country to cover the telephone calls and the cost of the network. Fast forward to 2012, there's a new conference coming in December that will be held in Dubai. And this time, the topic is how do we bring those what's called international telecommunications regulations, or ITRs, how do we bring those up to date and deal with the internet? Full stop. And needless to say, that's very interesting to those of us who have businesses that are built on the internet and all of the communications that goes along with that.
In what countries are we talking about? Everybody? What's being proposed?
So in
You take the countries. I'll take what's being proposed.
193 countries
Okay.
will be assembling in Dubai. So that's most of the countries in the world, and certainly all the ones with telecommunications infrastructure.
What are some of the things that are being proposed? Yeah.
So some of the things, as Paul mentioned, extending to the internet what was formerly solely related to international telecommunication services. So some of the things that are being proposed is extending security requirements to international telecommunication services well beyond anything that's currently in practice, dealing with making what we prefer to call voluntary standards, the technical standards that underpin the entire infrastructure of the internet and the applications that are written on the internet, as well as the telecommunications infrastructure, making those mandatory, so regulatory requirements. Dealing with spam, dealing with new ways of charging for accounts, a wide range of content controls, privacy, a lot of issues.
Well, and I think one of the things that's important is they're taking a treaty that was written in 1988 for a regulatory environment and an industry environment that is a product of 1988. Government-owned monopolies, the government was very heavily involved in the sector. And costs were relatively high. If you think about the costs of making an international phone call in 1988 versus today, and trying to somehow take that regulatory structure and put the internet into that.
Right.
And in ways that the internet wasn't really well suited to accommodate these kinds of regulations.
Right. And obviously the U.S. has a bit of a different stance than many other countries.
Yes, we've the market-driven developments in telecommunications services, as well as more broadly internet-provided services, has stood the U.S. in very good stead. It stood us in good stead globally as well as our companies. So we have a very open market, private sector-led approach. Let a thousand flowers bloom, and the market will determine what is the best approach. That's less common in other parts of the world.
But the internet grew up in this decentralized enviroment. It's a bottom-up architectural development. It's global. It's globally interoperable. It's voluntary in many cases, and it's collaborative. And this is how the internet, as you use it today, has developed into a global infrastructure that everyone depends upon. It didn't grow up in this heavily regulated or heavily centralized environment that really characterized the telecommunications era of 20 years ago.
I think one of the interesting things about the historical telecommunications environment and the ICT industry is that the telecommunications of the past were really driven by the need to figure out how to technically interconnect networks together in a standard way that would then extend the value of each network. And that was one of the hallmarks of telecommunications as it grew up. The computing industry, or the IT side of ICT industry, grew up often with consortium-based standards, individual inventions that were just put out there for people to adopt. It was much messier in many ways. And then as we move into cloud computing, where we are today, these two industries groups, they come together and they sort of collide and then mix, and then we get something new. And a challenge with that is the two historical cultures. And so when you take that and try to attach a legacy regulatory environment for an industry that was essentially, as Sally said, often government monopoly and standard interconnections and very rigorous, and this messy universe we have of computing and the internet and the web where everything is changing, every hour, you get a recipe for lots of interesting conversation, if nothing else.
Yeah, well, let's compartmentalize the way you guys are looking at this. First, Mary, you're from NIST,
Right.
agency of the U.S. government. I'm going to ask you about the government's position.
Okay. And I'm speaking from a technical agency. We're non-regulatory, and our big interest is in...
No, speak for the entire government.
Oh, okay.
No pressure. Go ahead.
No pressure. Well, I do know the U.S. government position because I've been participating in the Cordell preps for the World Conference on World Council on International Telecommunications. So this is the big meeting that Paul was talking about. And our strong preference, the U.S. government's strong preference, is that the international telecommunication regulations would remain relatively unchanged. They would provide the core of the regulatory aspect of the treaty, and that new issues would be dealt with through a different set of related instruments related to the treaty, resolutions or recommendations or opinions. I think, honestly, we feel that that's not going to be the case with the other 192 countries negotiated, but there are a couple bright lines that the U.S. government would not like to see crossed. We'd like to see the multi-stakeholder participation in the infrastructure and the governance of the internet continue, which means that industry and the civil society and consumers and governments all have a role to play. We'd like to see security not pulled into the mandatory part of the telecommunications regulations, and we'd like to see the voluntary nature of the technical documents that are written remain voluntary.
Okay, let's get a view outside of government.
Yeah.
Sally, explain briefly what the Internet Society is and does.
The Internet Society is a global nonprofit organization, and our fundamental purpose is to advocate on behalf of the Internet. We have over 55,000 members around the world, chapters around the world, and we're also the home for the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is the organization that develops many of the Internet protocols that underlie everything we do online. So we have a very keen interest in the policies, the technical implementation of policies that make the Internet grow.
So what then is your stance on these treaty changes?
Well, I think we're very concerned about the direction that the conference is going so far. We do not believe that the Internet is well suited for a static treaty. This last treaty's been around for almost 25 years. Obviously, a lot's changed since then. And one of the hallmarks of the Internet is its ability to grow, its ability to evolve, its ability to meet challenges that none of us sitting around this table understand or have thought of today. And so what we don't want to see in the treaty is a regulatory framework put in place that would lock in technology, an industry approach, a commercial business practice, or otherwise limit the ability of people to innovate using this technology or to express themselves freely. And some of the proposals that we've seen so far would do many of those things. There's opportunities for perhaps some good things to come out of this treaty negotiation, and we recognize that. But I think our position so far is really one of concern.
Now, obviously, we are relying on the Internet here today, streaming live for the first time at the Faculty Summit, and we're actually asking for folks to tweet questions throughout the summit. And you guys have sparked some interest. I got one tweet here who says, I'm an engineer, not a policy wonk.
Yeah.
And why should I care about some treaty on telecom regulation? So that's essentially, that's a relatable question to, I'm sure, some people.
Yeah, I think, the Internet really has, again, with its bottom-up, its decentralized beginnings, has allowed researchers and engineers to build and develop in many ways outside of any formal government structures. And there is this tendency, I think, among many in the engineering community to think that some of these policy discussions should just happen somewhere over there. But I think what we're hearing, what Mary just laid out with some of the agenda items for this conference, they really will affect the ability of engineers to do the engineering work that they do well, the technical excellence of the networks, and of the protocols that go into building those networks. So I think increasingly it's important that the engineering community, that the research communities pay attention to what's happening in policy discussions, And also, maybe even more important, that the policymakers pay attention and listen to the engineers and the technical community.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, there's people like that who are saying, "Why should I care?" Until their internet stops working,
Right.
Or
they're not going to
more
care.
expensive.
But then,
more expensive. You
Right,
can't get
right.
the content that you can't share data across networks.
right.
so-
Well, and even international, I'm seeing another tweet here saying, "Can you give specific examples of the kinds of changes that other countries would like to impose in the treaty?"
Sure. So one that would be really quite substantial concerns how traffic is routed around the internet. Today, the internet is designed so that traffic finds the most effective, least expensive route from one end to the other. And if there's something wrong in the middle, it routes around it. It finds some other way to go. That's the design of the network, and it's controlled by protocols, which are BGP in particular, which are running in the routers. Now, if you decided that you had to mandate all traffic running from, Microsoft here in Redmond to London has to go through a particular interchange point, and only that way, or all traffic going from, Microsoft here in Redmond to Israel, which may be a more apt analogy, would have to do that, then it dramatically increases the cost. It increases the engineering complexity of the network to make sure you could control all those routes. And across all of the routers on all of the interconnections of the internet. It's very expensive.
Wow. Can you? What are some of the other examples of here at home? Some of the other technical standards that might be pulled into the treaty. Things people maybe are totally unaware of that are being discussed.
Well, I mentioned security.
Yeah.
So a lot of